We do have quite some time now for discussion, and I welcome questions from the floor. So we have microphones here and microphones roaming, I believe. And the first question is right up in the back corner.
Thank you. Having listened to the speakers and have my own thoughts as we go through and drawn parallels historically with the most savage animal, some of the thoughts went to a German criminal lawyer who is now a resident in New Zealand, Dr. Hans Gruber. And he's quite furious at the way that prisoners who have been proven not guilty after 14 years are getting no recompense for it. But we go on from there, and he tells me there's three countries without a written constitution in the world. One of them is England, Israel, and New Zealand. And when you take these three countries without a written constitution, making it easy for oligarchs to manipulate through their media control and a collaborative state, this has allowed a legitimised theft of state health, education, housing, leading to the privatisation of profit-making prisons. Prisons providing cheap labour are a historic fact. Auschwitz, human warehouses in America, Camp 14 in North Korea, or private prisons in New Zealand. Closing state one is well known. Legitimate as against just. Money wars and inside job are two DVDs which gives a light into where the money's coming from.
Can we just ensure that it's a question,
I'll
please?
finish. What do you think of, it was, I'm trying to think who it was now. Oh yeah, it was Winston Peters and David Cunliffe at a meeting at Grey Power. They spoke of social engineering, and it was the latter, a Grey Power meeting. John Key has said, he stated, we have control of Grey Power. That's, I think it was every one of us should be very concerned of what's happening, and we should also recognise the fact there's 1 million people don't vote in this country. That's a huge proportion of people that disenfranchised themselves, and the reason they disenfranchised themselves is there's no right of recall. There should be a right of recall, and you could have these parasites out in a week. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, the second question, and please do keep it to a question for the speakers.
Yes, one question is that Magna Carta, when you read the Magna Carta, it talks about barons and earls, but it doesn't talk about poor people. And what do you think of that?
Does anyone want to take that up?
Exactly right. We see in the Magna Carta that the boundary around who the rights are granted to is a lot narrower than we would expect today. For me, the importance is that it was a start, and we see many of those principles progressively over time broadened out. And in many ways, you see the highest form of that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course every country has to sign up to as a condition of becoming a member of the United Nations. Really what we need to see is more recognition of those rights. That's of course what we're all about.
Thank you.
Can I just add a comment, sorry? Just building on what Grant said, if we look, I mean the Magna Carta is clearly a creature of its time. If we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was on the drafting committee, commented that it was the Universal Declaration was a Magna Carta for all people. And so that's what we're seeing, that the principles are developing to apply to all people over time.
Oh, hello. Just my question is this: the government has a quota, doesn't it, for refugees? How does this tally, or how is that made compatible with the various rulings that the Refugee Status Branch and the Immigration and Protection Tribunal give? Because just to explain the meaning of that question, is that presumably they're independent bodies that are tasked with issues where refugee status is in dispute or to be determined. What correlation, is there a correlation between the government's figure work vis-à-vis the number of refugees who may be permitted to be given asylum status formally during any particular year and the rulings and decisions of these independent bodies? It's an intriguing question. Perhaps the answer is unknown, but I think it's quite valid because, on the other hand, as one of the speakers was saying, that these bodies, such as the tribunal, are set up to have independent status to adjudicate in matters affecting human rights. But yet, if there's an underlying policy that the number had been an overall limitation, and that's enforced as a matter of law, what actually happens in practice? Does anyone know?
Andrew.
Thank you. Is that working? I can probably answer that best. I think you have to distinguish the...
Something else with it.
Try that one. Is it? Oh, that's better. Right. I can not just hear myself now. So just to distinguish, I think that the refugee quota, which is now 750 places per annum, is actually places given to the UNHCR for the most vulnerable cases for resettlement. And there are 27 countries now that undertake resettlement. Those refugees are already determined to have refugee status, so mandated as refugees, before they travel to New Zealand. And the role of the New Zealand government is to go out there and interview and select them and then bring them to New Zealand. When they arrive, they're already residents. So that's the quota. There is no number for those that seek asylum or claim refugee status in New Zealand. On average, we get around about 300 cases a year, and all of those are determined by the refugee status branch, and those that are not successful can go on to those other bodies for their appeals or other determinations. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
750 plus number more.
Plus whatever.
Okay, there and then back over here.
Given what strikes me is that the Magna Carta at its heart was really about the aggrieved talking to their government. And so for people who feel strongly that the refugee quota should be raised, what advice do you have, Mr. Lockhart, for how they can get to the government on that issue?
Does that work? Okay. Yes. Well, I think you've probably seen there's been editorials and there has been a number of representations, both from a number of distinguished and even from political parties themselves around raising the quota. But at the end of the day, that is a political decision taken by government, and the government have made it clear that the first chance to look at that quota is next year when the 3-year program is determined again. And certainly we will be, as a government agency responsible for the quota, providing advice to government. And as part of that process, the UNHCR also make a submission which goes into the cabinet paper, not only just around their priorities, but also around the numbers and where those refugees situations actually are and where they would like New Zealand to be taking people from. And all of that, at the end of the day, is a political decision taken by government and cabinet to determine not only the number of refugees that are resettled each year, but also where those refugees might come from and what categories of protection. So there might be women at risk, disabled cases, medical cases, and they will make determinations around that. There is also in the current 3-year program an allocation of 50 places that are available for large-scale emergencies, which in this 3-year period the government have used for resettlement of refugees from Syria. So the next 3-year quota starts in July 2016, and decisions will be taken by government before that.
Thank you all for the presentations. I have two questions. The first one is, when you refer to the freemen according to Magna Carta principle, and also considering the resources, the limitation of resources in New Zealand, it is acceptable that the New Zealand cannot raise this, the refugee quota to a considerable amount. But here the question is that to what extent New Zealand has helped this, they helped the refugee issue out of New Zealand. So are the principle of refugee or principle of free person only applied to refugee inside New Zealand or out of New Zealand? Because 100 years past the Magna Carta, definitely there have been many transformations in the nature of international migrations and refugee and the other issues. So Mr. Lockhart, if you give us some information about these, how New Zealand has helped the crisis in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, that there are influx of refugees over there. And also, my second question is about the academic discourses on, or academic debate on refugees. New Zealand is considered as an immigrant country, and a considerable number of this people are immigrant. So, but you can hardly find any research center on immigration and refugees. During the last week, I have searched, and I could only find 1 or 2 research center only in Otago University that is only related to Asian immigration, and also one in AUT that is about the health issues of the refugee. So the big question is why? What are the hidden policies behind this lack of academic debate and research center in New Zealand? Thank you.
It works. Okay, I'll answer them in the order that you've asked them. In terms of what does New Zealand do internationally in relation to refugee and protection, being part of the UNHCR is probably one of the key aspects of that, and we pay a large donation to the UNHCR to support their work every year. It goes through our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We belong to the ATCR, which is the group of countries that undertake resettlement, and that group includes both government officials and NGOs, looking at that whole area of not only resettlement but also protection, and in the last round of meetings around alternative forms of admission to countries outside of the quota itself, which provide protection to a broader range of people. Then there's the work, if you're talking about Syria itself, I talked about the 50 places that were made available under the large-scale emergencies for the first 2 years of this 3-year program. But in addition to that, a lot of aid has gone into the Syrian region as well to help support that. Because there's I think I talked about it, there's a lot of pressure on those neighbouring countries in terms of hosting the refugees from Syria themselves. And I think the other area around that is our seat on the Security Council, is that opportunity to have influence and a voice in that regard. In terms of the research, a lot of the refugee determination sits in the case law, both administrative and other areas. I'm kind of not so much aware of academic research outside of that, but there is quite a lot of research about the outcomes for refugees themselves from a variety of sources. And in fact, we had a National Refugee Resettlement Forum in May where we brought in a senior lecturer from Auckland University, Jay Marlowe, to talk to us about some of the research he had completed around resettlement in New Zealand. But it does tend to be, what are the outcomes for refugees? You've got the 10 years on research, you've got some of the research done by changemakers in Wellington, you've got Jay Marlowe's research and others, but it is mostly centred on what happened to refugees after they came, and how were they resettled into the country? What contribution did they make, and what challenges did they face?
Any additional? No? Okay. All right.
I'd like to ask the panel a specific question about the 1950 Refugee Convention and its protocols. I agree totally with Andrew Lockhart's analysis that this forms part of New Zealand law, both because it informs our international law obligations. We're a party to it, and it's also scheduled to the Immigration Act. And as both Andrew and Michael White indicated, the importance of the Magna Carta is its provisions on access to justice and the supremacy of the law. I'm not sure I agree with Michael on Chapter 42, the right to leave and return to the kingdom. I think that article had much more to do with barons who wanted to go off and look at their domains in Anjou and Normandy, or go off on a crusade without coming back to find that King John had filched their lands or something of that nature. Chapter 42 wouldn't have helped you much if you were a serf in Wiltshire or a woman living in Kent. But to return to my question, we know what the 1950 convention 65 years ago does. It provides protection for people being persecuted on the 4 convention grounds. But of course those grounds don't include things like climate change, people being displaced by war, or indeed those thousands of people frolicking around Calais at the moment who feel that it's much better for them to seek residence in Britain than it is in France, in other words, seeking a better economic life. So the question I have is this: is the 1950 convention, now 65 years old, an adequate vehicle to control legally the movement of people? And if it isn't, what should we put in its place?
My view is the Refugee Convention isn't designed to manage the migration flow, and so it can't do that in and of itself. The second thing I'd say is it definitely should not be replaced. It's doing a good job for what it is aimed to do, and to deal with the developing issues with migration, there needs to be some thought to some additional steps rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. There are the protections under the Convention Against Torture, so protected person status that can be granted under that convention, and also the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And both of those options exist in New Zealand under our immigration law. Beyond that, I mean, I think it really is a global political solution that needs to be developed, and it's something that's going to be a long, hard road.
I'll make a short comment. I think the one thing, when the convention was developed and designed, it was very much in light of the events and things of the Second World War and the aftermath of that. But I think one thing around the convention and the way in which countries, the whole international approach to it, has been adaptable over the last 60 years to changing circumstances. But you're right, it doesn't extend to climate change, and it doesn't extend to economic refugees. It is about protection from persecution, and fundamentally that's where it sits.
Okay.
Thank you. A group I'm working with find that there are several issues that have never been addressed publicly, and they are going at it in their own manner. But there are seminars run around the country for immigrants. They're compulsory, and some of the people, I've met them, they're very charming people, but they're given material that doesn't add up. And this is an embarrassment to me. I'm part Ngāi Tahu, and certain things are coming out that should never have happened. Now, one of the systems that's needing attention is the difference between our basic statutes. There are about 50 or 60 you could name, and they are causing trouble around the community and in other Commonwealth countries. Unfortunately, in Waikato, tribes have got together and they have been blessing immigrants as honorary Māori. I don't know where it leads. I haven't got into it. I've given all my research to the Māori King, and I think you give it to the churches as well. If you've got anything that needs to be addressed, they are looking and they are asking. Unfortunately, another factor that we should have known, Mei Chen's interest and goodwill for immigrants has led to some young people suggesting that they form almost a political party of every country's immigrants. Now, I'm not going to go any further because other issues will follow. Thank you.
Okay, and we have a question here, please.
I'm a PBS and Democracy Now! TV watcher. I don't know anything else about the world, really. But I know that the recent... I'm really concerned about the attitude of New Zealanders to what is going on in the world, because we seem to be in the dark ages. The figure you give of asylum seekers is 20 million, and I've heard that it's 60 million and rising very fast. And out of that, there would be 5 to 10 million of those would be children. So we're sitting in a country that you can't get to by a boat, and you don't want to increase the number of immigrants from 760 legally and decently. What in the hell is the matter with you?
Maybe just one thing to clear up on the numbers, because I know there's a lot of numbers around this. So the figure that UNHCR just brought out, latest figure on number of displaced people is 59.5 million. So that includes people who've fled within their own countries and are displaced. The total refugee numbers refer to people who've crossed a border and are outside their country. That number's lower, and I think is the one Andrew was quoting. But to pick up the substantive point, yeah, I think, and partly the previous question on the Refugee Convention, I think we've actually got potentially a pretty good international system for dealing with this. What we really need is for countries, I think, Amnesty International believes, to step up consistently around the world. Overwhelmingly, the burden is falling with those countries that by accident of geography happen to be on the borders of countries where human rights abuses and wars are happening. Lebanon, population almost identical to New Zealand, 4.5 million, but it's a fraction of our size. It's about the size of Taranaki, and they've had over 1 million people come across the border. Largely, they've kept their borders open. Really, we've got to support them in doing that, but also there's the opportunity for New Zealand and other countries, not just New Zealand, to really step up in terms of the support that we give.
We do know that, besides the fact there's probably about 10 million kids wandering around with nowhere to live, but we do know that epidemics arise out of this rapid movement of populations. So like the flu epidemic in 1918 killed 100 million people. There's only 10 million soldiers killed. Now, if you're going to watch
I want to step in here because...
Why are you not thinking of the fact that with all this disturbed population moving everywhere, there will be consequences that you are not looking at, which are not about refugee status.
So I think Grant's point was a really good point to end on, which was really a call for action. And we can hear in the room that there's a lot of concern about these numbers, about the lack of consistency and clarity around the rule of law and how it's applied. And I would like to end by thanking our guests again. So thank you very much to Andrew, Michael and Grant. And you're, of course, welcome to stay and chat. There does seem to be quite a lot of energy, but we are over time. So thanks very much.